In 1946, my dad was living in Idaho, and a guy said, let's go to Alaska and work construction. And my dad said, I don't have the money. And the guy said, pay me out of your first check. So my dad went and worked the summers of 46 and 47 in Alaska. And then my folks got married in June of 1948 and moved to Alaska. And he worked construction.
Where was your mother?
My mother was in Idaho, Coeur d'Alene.
Okay.
So they spent the summers apart. And in 1950, I was the first oops. My mother said that because they weren't ready for kids then. But I showed up. And such and so. And then I had a brother show up 3 years later, and a sister 10 years after I was born, and my last brother 13 years after I was born. So when my mom walked through the door with my youngest brother, I said, Mom, watch out for 70 and 73. And she didn't see any humor in that. In fact, she tossed my youngest brother to my dad, and I went over the fence at the front yard. And there were 2 steps down from that, but I went over the fence because I didn't want to spend time. Took her a little while to get over that. But growing up there, I could always tell people I went to school in the dark and came home in the dark. That's why I didn't understand a lot, because during the summer you have you can come up close to 24 hours of sunlight, but during the winter the sun isn't up for that long. So it goes. So the whole time I went to school, I managed to be able to never be able to ride the school bus. Because they always decided that I lived too close to the school. So I walked to school my whole school life. And such, so it was just an interesting thing to do.
What town is this in?
Anchorage.
Anchorage, okay.
Oh, wow.
I lived in the big city. When I came to Graceland, people wouldn't believe that it was a big city. So I told them during the winter, instead of driving on the roads, we took the wheels off, put them on skis, and had the dogs pull us. And everybody accepted that. You know, it just went, and then a couple people went up an older youth service corps to a reunion, and they came back and they told me, they said, Anchorage is a modern city. And I said, I tried to tell you that, and you wouldn't believe me. So I told you what you wanted to hear. And they were kind of unhappy with me and stuff. That meant, because living in Alaska, about every 4 years we'd fly to Seattle, and my folks would pick up a new car. And we'd drive to California and see my grandparents down there for about 5 days. We'd drive up to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho and see my mom's mother for a few days, and then we would drive up the Alcan Highway.
Gosh.
And stuff and get back home. But the cars were cheaper in Seattle, so it kind of paid to pick it up there and to do. So I've been over the Alcan Highway several times. And every time we went, it changed, because the first time it was built, they told the guys on the bulldozers, follow the engineers. Literally because they wanted the land route to Alaska during World War II, start of World War II. So that's how it was built. And it was a dirt road for a long time. But growing up, my dad worked for the post office and then did some other side jobs, because the post office at that time did not pay that good, that well. So when I was young, we had some people that were my Alaska grandparents, Roger and Leota Langdon, who told him, said, listen, if you'll build us a house, we'll give you 10 acres off of our homestead. So we built the house and got the 10 acres, and Dad built a cabin, and my mother decided that with all the trees and stuff that were down there, because we were hauling stuff up in the trailers to do that, we should cut a load of wood and sell it. You know, a cord of wood and sell it, and that would help pay for the trip. And little did she know what that started. Because the little trailer became a bigger trailer because we had to haul more stuff up, which means we could take more stuff down. And that graduated into a 2.5-ton truck. And that graduated into us selling an awful lot of firewood. And I've split hundreds of cords of firewood.
With an axe,
No,
with a splitter.
with a splitting maul and wedges,
Oh
sledgehammer.
my gosh.
And it got to a point where my dad found a guy down in North Carolina that would make 4-foot handles for the splitting mauls and the sledgehammers. And he found another guy that made 8-pound splitting maul heads, and we had 12-pound sledgehammer heads. And I used to go out and split wood with a splitting maul in one hand and a sledgehammer in the other.
Yeah, gosh.
And my shoulders started at my ears.
Yeah, I'll bet they did.
And such, but it was a way of doing and having extra money. So when it would come, like over Thanksgiving break, I'd go down the Friday after Thanksgiving. Dad would be delivering mail, and I'd go down and split wood. And I'd split, and I'd fill the truck and deliver 3-quart of wood in the morning, split and deliver 3-quart in the afternoon, and then have more ready, so when Dad came home, we'd go and take the last doing.
Define a cord of
A
wood.
cord of wood is 4 foot by 4 foot by 8 foot. And that's, doing. And then I finally figured out that instead of splitting the wood, one time I got everything that was cut up split, because we had a lot that Dad had bought about 4 lots up from where we lived. And I knew we were gonna do it. I started splitting the logs. I hit it with a splitting maul and then put a wedge in, drive the wedge, and then take the splitting maul down and hit it again. So then when we put it on, Dad had built a horse, which is kind of a sawhorse that would hold wood. I could just set the logs in there and he would cut them, and then we could just throw the wood on and not have to do. But it's a way that it gave us extra money and such, which helped a lot and stuff doing. When we had, and we spent almost every weekend going up to the cabin that was up about 50 miles from where we lived. And Dad decided that since we had this ground and out in front of the cabin used to be a field, we should plant potatoes. Well, my dad doesn't do anything in small ways. There were four rows of potatoes about 100 yards long, which meant when we went up, we had to hoe them, and we had to hill them. Then we had to dig them, which means we came home with like a ton of potatoes. But it would go. And he decided that we could grow carrots and stuff too. And especially when he found out that we could store carrots downstairs in the basement of a house. You could put them in sand because it was cool, dry sand, and the carrots would stay forever. So he'd plant like 50 yards of carrots. So they would go.
And they were bigger because of Alaska. I mean, they get big. Right.
And the way they get the huge cabbage is, they start those cabbage indoors in 5-gallon buckets, an individual seed, 5-gallon buckets that are hinged. And they plant the cabbage and it weighs about 10 pounds when they put it out in the field. But because there's so many hours of daylight, and it, at that time had been staying cool, great temperatures for growing that, they would grow to the end of the year. And then that's why they would get 50-pound cabbages. But when they planted them, they started out weighing 10 to 12 pounds. So, just, you know, it was great. The other thing that we did, and got started on when I was young, Dad always hunted for moose and caribou, and so when I was 12 years old, he told me it's time for you to go out, you know, and to help with this, because that's what we ate during the winter. You know, going to a drive-in was a major event for us because Mom cooked at home. We just didn't go out and do it. So I just learned to do that. And when I was about 14 years old, Dad decided he didn't want to pay for having the moose butchered, and he found a deal on a meat saw, so he bought a meat saw. And he cut everything else up himself. And the only reason he could do that is because when I was 11 and 12 years old, the basement wasn't as big. So we had rollers that went down there, and I would open up the back porch. We had a kind of a trap door thing you could open up. And I would go down and fill 5-gallon buckets and dump them in a tub, then go up, pull the tub up and dump it in a wheelbarrow and take it across the road and dump it because nobody was living over there. Oh my. It's where the dirt could go. And I spent my days, and I increased the depth of the basement by about 20 feet that summer.
How did you keep the meat cool all the winter?
Because we had multiple freezers.
Oh, okay.
He would cut it up and then we would freeze it.
But a moose is so big, it would fill up a ton of freezers.
Yeah, you know, they would dress out somewhere around 800, 900 pounds.
Right.
That's what we do. So we had a deal. That didn't include when we'd go up and get caribou and would hunt for them. And caribou are a dumb animal, honestly. They travel in huge herds, 30 and 40,000 head of caribou in a herd. But if the back caribou of that whole group decides to turn around and go back, the whole group turns around and goes back. And such doing. If you want to attract them, you go out and tie a pole on a tree and run a yellow flag up it. And the yellow flag goes, and they'll come because they're wondering what the flag is. And the Fish and Game Department finally made a law saying you can't do that because people were doing it. But caribou were an interesting animal because when you shot them, there's a musk gland on their back leg just below the joint. So when you went up, you had to cut that leg off and throw it so that the meat wouldn't taste as wild. And that's things I learned and found.
I'm going to remember that.
You're getting old enough, you might not.
Have you had caribou meat lately, ever? Now?
I haven't had caribou meat in probably 40 years.
But you'd know it if somebody put it in front of you.
Yes. And such. One of my mother's favorite things to do was to have people over, and they would say that they didn't like moose and caribou, and she would feed them. And she'd always get compliments on her roast beef, because she always fixed a roast. And when it was over, she'd look at them and tell them, she said, "You ate moose." Because we took care of them that way. My mother sewed up game bags that were about 4 feet wide, about 6 feet tall, and such, with openings with drawstrings in them. So when we shot a moose, we gutted it and we skinned it, because Dad's thing was, this moose lives and survives during the winter. So that hide holds in an awful lot of heat. So does the caribou. So you need to get that hide off so that the meat can dry, so it doesn't get as strong. We would see people coming back that had tied a caribou over their front hood and had not gutted it yet,
Oh, man.
and going the heat into it. I saw dogs that would not eat the meat. You know, 'cause I mean, it was just really strong. We had, there were some German guys that came and opened up a butcher sausage making shop in Anchorage, and so we went down and talked to them about doing this stuff, and they were always, you know, they would take stuff in and do it. So we took a bunch of stuff in and they made great sausage and stuff. It was really good. And one year there were a lot of people that got caribou and they weren't interested in the hearts and livers. So I gathered all the hearts and livers, and I had about 50 of each. And I took these down to these sausage makers and asked, can you do anything with this? And they said yes, and they looked at me and they said 50-50. And I went, what do you mean by 50-50? And they said, if you give us half, we won't charge you. And I shook their hands right away, because that was a good deal. So they made liverwurst and some other things out of the liver. They made some sausage out of the heart, and it was just absolutely great, great stuff. And such doing.
I'm really enjoying this testimony.
So, then, when I was not baptized until I was 12 years old. And we were at reunion, and Bill Kleinfelder came up there and wondered what this 12-year-old kid was doing not being baptized.
Slacker.
So they asked me, did I want to be baptized? And I really hadn't thought about it, but I looked at Mom, and I wanted to be baptized, because I didn't want to be in trouble. And if I hadn't been baptized, Mom would have been really unhappy, and Mom being unhappy was not something you wanted to experience. You know, just what, so I was baptized, so I wasn't baptized till I was 12. So you understand why I'm kind of slow. Continue on in a bunch of other.
But could I ask you a question? Did you have a congregation there?
Yes, there was a congregation in Anchorage and there was a congregation in Fairbanks.
So when you were growing up, they did have a congregation?
We had a congregation. Lloyd Hirschman was there as an appointee. Eldon Dickens was there as an appointee. Bill Kleinfelder was there as an appointee. Glenn Campbell was in Fairbanks for a while, and he was in Anchorage for a while. So we met a lot of people. There were reunion grounds at Lake Louise, which was about, well, it was further for people from Fairbanks to come.
In Canada,
No, in Alaska.
there's a Lake Louise in
The
Canada.
lake, there's a Lake Louise in Alaska. And it was on an island. That was about 25 feet from the shore. But the dock was about 2 miles away, so had to take everything across in boats or on a barge. And when you went to reunion, you had to plan that it was going to be hot, it was going to be cold, it was going to be dry, it was going to be wet. So everybody brought a lot of clothes that they didn't use, which means they had to be taken across and they had to be taken back. And the first few years we went, everybody cooked for themselves. So you brought all your own food too. and you brought the stuff for close. And then people decided, you know, this is not a good idea, we need to build a dining hall and a kitchen. So we did that. But then you had to bring everything for that, and we really didn't have freezing, so when we brought the stuff, we went out and dug around on the tundra and pulled it up, put plastic in there, put the stuff in for each day, and then folded the tundra back over because the permafrost was there, and it would keep it cold. And so there were little flags that were for Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And because I had more brawn than brain even when I was young, it was part of our job in the morning. Dad and I went down, we'd flip that up and we'd carry everything for the day's meals down to the cook shack so they would have it to cook. Because when you cook for big groups like that, when people come in for breakfast, the cooks are working on lunch. And when you come in for lunch, the cooks are starting stuff for supper. So after about 4 years of that, my mother looked at it and went, you know, I'm not happy with the way they're doing stuff because they're just throwing out too much food and such. And somebody looked at her and said, well, if you don't like the way it's being done, you need to do it. And so she did. So that meant that we were involved in a lot of the shopping to get the food, because she said, I can do better menus than what they're doing, we're gonna do my menus. So for 2 weeks before reunion, be going around with her, and we'd fill up her station wagon, you know, several times, which meant Dad drove up with a 16-foot trailer with all this stuff on it that was covered by tarps with straps over it, and we loaded all on the barge, you know, picking up, carrying everything onto the barge, took the barge across the lake, and then took everything up to put in the kitchen. And invariably, when we were doing that, the tractor that we usually hauled the stuff up the hill on would break down. So we ended up carrying most of the boxes up by hand. But everybody that was there came down and helped. It was just part of what you did and such. One of the questions Marion sent me was, why do I help so many people? And it's probably part genetic, because it was the way I was, she's shaking her head, yes. It's the way I was brought up. When I was growing up, with the potatoes we grew, and the fact that a lot of years, both Dad and I got a moose, we had extra meat. My dad was a mail carrier. I would get home from school, and Dad would call up, and he would say, you need to go down and get this, 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 and this, and take it to this address. And he found a family that didn't have a lot of food, so I'd be going down and getting potatoes, carrots, moose meat, just whatever else we had and stuff, and putting it in boxes, loading it in, and I would take it to the house. And I'd just knock on the door, and they'd look at me and they'd say, oh, you're George's son. Because I look just like him. And she says I act like him too much too.
Yes, he does.
And such, so we would do that. And Dad somehow had found out about a freight warehouse there in Anchorage that needed somebody to do some maintenance work and stuff. So he was down there, and he was there one night, and 100-pound sack of flour, somebody flipped plywood up and it broke it, and the edge of it, and it can't go to the bakery there, but they taped it so they didn't want it. Dad said, what are you gonna do with it? And they said, we throw this away. Dad says, throw it in the back of that pickup. So he came home with a 100-pound sack of flour. And Mom decided that was a good thing, so she made cinnamon rolls. And the next night sent the cinnamon rolls with Dad down to the warehouse when he went down there. And the guys decided this was a really great thing. So about once a week, a bag of flour got broken. You know, and it just went. And one summer, my Uncle Edward Ed, my mother's brother, was very nice to me. He owned part of a construction company. And when I was 15 years old, he got me into the laborers union. He said, do you want to be a carpenter? Make your life as a carpenter? And I said, no, I'm going to college. I don't want to be a carpenter. You know. And so he got me into the laborers union. And in 1965, I started out earning $5.85 an hour. And I worked for less than a month, and I was so great that they raised me to like $6.25 an hour. Actually, I wasn't that great. What they did is a contract kick do it. But what my uncle told me was, he said, okay, he says, I'll give you this job, but you open a savings account. And I get copies of your savings account. And at least 80% of what you net goes in there so you can pay for college. So that worked out great. Actually, I put more than that in because he did. And I left Graceland owing my uncle $500. I paid for all the rest of mine by that. So I owe my Uncle Edward a great, great debt of attitude. One of the other things that happened with Uncle Edward is they really didn't have kids, so he kind of adopted me, and when he would go down to Seward, Alaska to go fishing, because he liked to fish for silver salmon out in Resurrection Bay, he'd take me along because he could write it off as entertaining the crew. And we would go down Friday night after work and stay and go out, and at that time the limit was 6 salmon apiece. So he would catch 6 silver salmon, I would catch 6 on Saturday, we'd do that on Sunday. And I'd bring those home, and there was a restaurant there that, because he'd been in there doing stuff, the guy would let us keep the salmon in his cooler. Well, every time we did, when we went home, we only went home with 23 salmon because we always gave him one. Because it was good relationships to do that. So that went, and one year, the 4th of July came on Thursday. And my uncle decided that it was a real good idea not to have the carpenters come back Friday because they wouldn't get anything done. Because they would probably still be drunk. Not hungover, but still probably be drunk because they were. So it's just doing, so he looked at me and he says, we're gonna take off Wednesday and down. We said, because we're gonna have Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday to fish. So I said, that's a great thing, I can go for that. So we went down and we fished and we went out, and it turned out in the first hour and a half we'd caught our salmon. We hit a school and they were there. And he said, I don't want to go back in. He said, but I'm a little tired, so I'm going to take a nap. And I said, well, how about if we go over and anchor here and I'll see if we can't catch some halibut or, black sea bass. And he said, okay. And he changed his boat that over the inboard-outboard engine was a cutting board, so we could clean fish. And under the bunks, he'd had it changed so there were refrigeration units. So you could put the fish in there and keep them cool. And stuff. So I'm there and I'm taking some of the stuff and I put it down and I'm catching these halibut like this and these sea bass, and I'd get a couple, clean them, flay them. And when the buckets were full, I'd take them down and dump them in the plastic buckets he had there. Well, this kept going, and we went. The next day, we went out and did the same thing. But the second day, because we were catching and we were in the same place, one time I hooked something and I went, this is really, really heavy. And I'm going, this must be a bigger halibut. Well, I pull it up close, and when you have a big halibut like this, they stay sideways. They don't fight. So what you have to do, you have to pull them up because they're flat. And when you get it up, you drop it and then you reel. And you gain your 2 or 3 inches of line because the fish goes back down. So it just takes a long time to get the fish up. And I look, and here's this huge fish. So I yell at Uncle Leonard. I say, you need to come. And he looked, he says, why? And I said, because I got a really big one. And he came up and he looked at me and he said, you lie, you got a huge one. So we went and we were looking, and when halibut come in, one that size has to be dead because they flip around and they're so strong they would break legs and such. So he got on the radio and he was calling, because we were gonna need some help. And finally a guy that had a boat that was like for commercial fishermen came. And he said, come over and get in here and do it. And I'm sitting there and I'm fighting. He says, now when you get it up and I tell you to freeze, don't move. And he says, we're going to land this. And so I'm sitting there and I get it up and he says, freeze. And I freeze. And this harpoon comes by my ear. And I'm going, what is this? Well, it went through and then it expanded and then it was on a rope and they could pull it up. Because he said, I'm concerned that sharks are going to come around and eat this. So we got it in and got it up, and by this time my arms are exhausted. I'm tired. And the darn thing weighed 220 pounds. Just a huge fish. So when we went into town, when we got back to the dock, a kid came down and says, I'll clean your fish for 50 cents a piece. And my uncle said, yes.
250 pounder.
So we give him all these fish and he's doing it. And then we come walking up with this other one. And he just looked at, and he started laughing. And everybody else around was laughing at him because it was, doing, and actually he got paid more. But I went in and I called my dad and I said, you need to come because we've got a lot of fish. And Dad came down and looked, and I said, and you need to bring the coolers, because Dad had built 4x4x8 boxes with styrofoam glued in and then fiberglass, so you could put fish in and throw ice on top of it and keep them cool. So he came and looked and he says, we can't use this much. So when we drove back to town, we stopped by the soup kitchen and looked at the guy and said, how much do you want?
Yeah.
And so they did. So that was not an unusual thing for us to do.
Okay. I wished you had some interesting stories to tell, because this is getting a little slow.
I realize that. I told you I was slow. I went with till I was 12.
Let's shift gears a little bit, though, and talk about your religious thoughts and your religious journey from young to now, and make it in 15 minutes.
My religious journey is still continuing. I will admit, when I was in the first in the church and first in the priesthood, I was probably fairly rigid and laistic and such, going on the way things should go. And as I said last week, when we were at that aunt's niece's wedding and such, it changed things for me. I was going, you know, this isn't the way we should treat people. You know, and as I started going more and reading more and looking at things, it needed to be ruled, in my mind, needed to be ruled by love and such. And so that changed, and that's why I got involved in some things. When Ann and I retired, Gwen asked us if we would help unload the truck at the food pantry and such, and we decided we could do that because that would help people. That would be, you know, ministry stuff going. And that went for a little while, and then Gwen looked at me and said, we need to have somebody come on the third Wednesday of the month when we do home deliveries, because we were still at the Methodist church, and carry all the boxes up the stairs, because it's hard on Connie and I to carry all the boxes up the stairs. So I ended up doing that, and I was there doing that when Connie and Gwen were talking one night and said, we've got to find somebody to come and work on Tuesdays, because it was two teachers that had been doing the stuff on Tuesday, and they were going to go back to teaching. So I went home and asked Ann, I said, is there any reason I can't, you know, that I couldn't do that? And her answer was something to akin, yes, you can do that, and it'll get you out of my hair soon. She didn't say that, but that was kind of. And so that's why I started doing that, because I just thought, you know, there are people that need this, and if you can help get that done, then you need to do it. So I worked every Tuesday for a long time, and Gwen told me right at the start, she said, I want to find some other people to do this, because if you can't come Tuesday, I have a hard time finding, and we just need to have other people do it.
Tell them what your Tuesday job is.
My Tuesday job is, after people like Howard and Benita pull stuff off the shelf, I put it in boxes, carry the boxes out to a little cart, and then take it down to the car and load it in the car. I'm the mule. And she would say it happens at home too, because I'm stubborn and such. And I just look at that as that's part of my ministry, because it helps feed people and such doing. And then I'm not working as many nights because Gwen found some other people, so we can switch off, which makes it do it. But we still help on that. Something I wanted to go back to is when I was getting ready to graduate from high school, Lloyd Hirschman pushed me to come to Graceland. And so I sent in an application, and I got a letter back that I was the first one accepted to my class, because he was doing it that early. And it was okay with doing that, because I've got relatives all over the West Coast. And I figured if I was gonna come to college, I needed to pick it up and, you know, survive on my own and not have pressure to go see people on every weekend and doing that stuff. So I came and did, and I was the first one in my generation of family on either side that graduated from college. I've got a cousin who was older than I am that finished her degree later. But as far as I know, we were the only two that graduated from college, and I'm the first one that went on and got any advanced degree.
This is going back, but I don't want to miss it. When I hear you talk about your dad and all the things that he made you do, did you ever rebel?
No, because that was not acceptable. I did in other ways. My dad only had an eighth, if I remember right, an eighth grade education. My mom made it to 11th grade, but she wasn't going to undress in gym class, so neither one of them ever graduated from high school. But they wanted me to graduate from high school, and they wanted me to go to college. My Uncle Eddard wanted me to go to college. Because when I worked construction, I saw all these broken down people, in their 60s, 50s and 60s, struggling to work construction long enough to be able to retire and get their things. But it's just that the job did that to them. So I did, I went to Graceland, I went out to Washington State, because Alaska residents were supposed to be treated like Washington residents for medical school. And so I was trying to get in. And I realized that wasn't gonna happen with my 3.4 average. I didn't get an interview, but a Washington resident with a 1.75 average got an interview. So I didn't, and I'm looking and I'm going, I'm not gonna be a dentist because I'm not gonna look in people's mouths. So one of the instructors there said, how about optometry? So I looked at that and did that. I have to tell you a story. When I got to Graceland, because I'd been brought up on this thing of fairness all my life, fairness, and it drives her nuts. I came to Graceland, and they had dum-dum courses for chemistry and biology. Because chemistry and biology are hard for people. But when I sat down in history courses and English courses, I had to sit with English and history majors. And I went, English and history can be as hard for some people as math and science is for other people.
Oh, man, I don't know about that.
Hey, trust me.
Okay, but
Trust me. So I went in and talked to your dad and said, this just isn't right. It isn't going. And he said, well, if we tried to do it, we'd have to do this. And I said, but you make adaptations for the biology and the chemistry. Why can't you make it for these other things? And they wouldn't go and they wouldn't do it. One more story on that. I was taking, I forget what course it was, but under Velma Rouge. And she did a test. And she looked and she says, what does this play mean to you? So I wrote what it meant. And I had a D. So I went and talked to her. I said, why do I have a D? She says, well, it's this. And I said, well, what were you looking for? She says, well, the experts say this. And I said, but your question didn't ask me what the experts said. The question asked me, what does it mean to you?
yeah, good point.
So she changed my grade because she says it's yes. After that, I looked at Cliff Notes so that I could write down what the experts said. So, I'm not always dumb. Sometimes I
That's smart.
truly adapt. But I guess, to go back to my spiritual thing, I'm becoming less and less rigid in what does, and I will say that probably 90% of my ministry is not in this congregation. And I will say this, and I don't want you to take it that I'm bragging with this and doing, but when I'm on Facebook and I'm on a bunch of fishing groups and somebody says something and says, pray for me, I send them a prayer. I don't say, I'm going to, or I'll pray for you, or something like this, I bring up in a private message or something, I send them a prayer. Because I just feel a bird in the hand is worth a whole lot of them in the bush. That's it. And I can't tell you how many times I've had people come back to me and say, I still have that over my desk.
Oh,
You know,
nice.
I still have this or something, because it's an experience they don't have. Some of these people have come to me and said, hey, so-and-so needs a prayer, you need to do it. And I'm just ornery enough that I say, right after you do. And, you know, and I challenge them to do that, to give people that sort of experience that they have.
And he does not allow them to use his name in any way on any of those prayers for any reason.
That statement's always at the bottom. Just because it's not about me and such do it. I have to tell this story because if Jack looks at this and I don't say it, he will be very unhappy.
Did you say Jack?
Jack Ergle.
That's right, I do.
He asked me one time why I went up.
I put my coffee down.
Still doing AV and such, and I told him guilt. My least favorite story in the scriptures is the story of Dorcas, because she never taught her replacement. She had to be, in my mind, they had to bring her back to life because nobody could do her job, which I kind of hold against Dorcas. And such doing. And since Jim was the only one that was doing Zoom, I kind of understand the AV stuff. I told Ann, I said, I need to go up and learn to do Zoom. You know, I feel guilty. So I went up and I told Jim, and Jim says, I will show you. And I said, no, you will make me do it because I have to have muscle memory. I need to do it multiple times so that I can get it.
That's right.
And Jim put up with a horrendous amount of stuff, trust me, until I finally kind of got it and such.
I want you to tell them your physical experience of baptism.
When I got baptized, the ice had only been off the lake for like a week or something. And it was cold water. And so went down, went out, and they did, you know, I was baptized and came up and immediately had a blanket around me because it was just really cold. But that meant that year for all the preparation for reunion, you know, a bunch of us usually went up 2 weeks ahead of time and opened stuff up and swept everything out and all this, and there was still ice on the lake. So we called up and said, hey, you know, there's still ice. So what happened that year is there were a couple of people, there was one guy that had a snowcat and he drove us around so we could walk across and go up, and when we got ready to go, he came back and picked us up because it was about a 2-mile hike around the lake to get just to cross over. But we had some good times at reunions there. For a lot of years, we stayed in tents. So when it rained and it was muddy, you were miserable.
Are you still doing flies?
Yes,
Oh, good golly, yes.
almost every day.
Okay.
But some may not know why you're doing those.
I every year send somewhere around 1,800 flies to Casting for Recovery, which is for women that have had breast cancer. Fly fishing is physical therapy. It's the movement, so that was started. A few years after that, they started a group called Real Recovery for men that have had any sort of cancer, because it's a support group when they have retreats. And I send about the same number of flies to them. There's a military group here that one of my friends was in charge of for a while, and I usually send them some flies. I send Steve Easy and Scott Murphy flies because they're both
Fishing.
fly fishing.
Jim Slaughter.
Jim Slaughter gets some. Came to Sal, but Terry Williams, who we met one time when we went down to Mid-South Reunion. I've sent him some flies. There was just a group in Texas that was talking about a bunch of them coming up and doing, so I tied some for them. Because I've only got about 2 or 3 lifetime supply of fly tying stuff. But she shakes her head yes, but she's the same way with yarn.
That's right.
And so I just do, but I consider that part of my ministry. You know, can help, so. So you can probably end the recording, Paul.
I want to jump in here and just say that I am always amazed that when anybody needs to move in this town, I can usually count on Kelly being there, Stu a lot, but Rick Zieger is always there with that unforgettable pickup truck with the white pipe framing in the bed.
It died.
It's gone? Rick, I am amazed at you because I hate to move people. And you're there every time. True story.
Dale. And
Right?
Dale.
Dale also.
Dale too, but Dale complains a lot. I'm kidding, he does not. Linda, I'm sorry. Dale is there too.
And Dale and I have known each other since 1968. We roomed together for several years at Graceland.
Really? How did you meet Ann? You haven't even talked about that.
Yeah, and your kids.
Your children too.
We met in biology and chemistry labs
Okay.
and such going. And so,
Was it love at first sight? Did you say, who is that woman?
no. In fact, I had a much better relationship with her mother
I don't think we want to go
We don't
there.
want to go there, Rick. So-
long before we got together.
He knew Mom first.
Mom first.
How do you know her? She was checking tickets.
She checked tickets at the lunch aisle, and there were some militant students of color come to Graceland, and we'd be in line, and they'd walk up. 10 or 15 of them would come in and just join somebody else in line. And because I have this fairness thing in my head, I would come out of line and go up in front of them. And they would object to that. And I would say, but you cut in front of me, so I should be able to cut in front of you. And that's kind of how I met Irene, because Irene would be telling them, you need to go back to the end of the line, and they would say, you can't make me.